in his State of the Nation address. We know about the economic challenges. Our economy, even though it has returned to the pre-COVID state, but it is not envisaged that it will grow beyond 1% in the next few months or maybe a year or two. It's not a positive picture, but we have a role to play as the National System of Innovation to think about what can we do to contribute towards making sure that our economy recovers speedily and grows. Internationally, science, technology, and innovation have been recognized as having the potential to contribute towards growth. It has a long-term possibility. So we have a big role to play. But secondly, we know that millions of young people are out of work and out of school. They're supposed to be working. They are unemployed. So again, unemployment is the big challenge. Poverty levels are high. South Africa rates amongst the top countries in terms of poverty. And increasingly, inequality is widening, and digital economy and transformations are further exacerbating the inequalities that we're experiencing. But as you'll realize in some of the readings, inequality is a global phenomenon. The only difference is that it's acute. And women, and rural women in particular, they bear the brunt of such inequality. And therefore, that's why it's important when you think about the impact of these human conditions, you also appreciate how they manifest themselves in terms of gender oppression. Hence here we talk about the triple oppression when it relates to women. But we also appreciate colleagues that we're living under very difficult austerity conditions in South Africa as a consequence of our economy not having grown in the recent past. Typical example, and we must apologize up front, that we are not able to offer you coffee. It's part of that. National Treasury has provided directives that state institutions should stop organizing conferences, workshops, and traveling and so forth. We are grateful, CEO of NRF, that NRF could avail its venue to us to host this event. So we want to make it clear to colleagues, don't go out and start saying, yeah, when your principals are refusing you to organize events, and say, but NACI was able to host an event. No, NRF was grateful. They offered this building for free. Right? So that's the situation we find ourselves. Treasury has already indicated that the budget, the STI budget, is going to be reduced by 3 billion in the next 3 years or so. It's a reality. This year, it's 311 million rand has already been taken from our modest. That's the biggest. That's why, colleagues, this conversation this morning is important, because we also want to explore different ways in which we need to be thinking about investment in the context of climate change and sustainability challenges that we are confronted with. Because as I was, identifying some of the factors or the elements of our context, climate change is and ecological challenges constitute another threat to human species. It's a challenge that we are confronted with. I was saying to our guest this morning that at least we are happy that in South Africa, the top leader and his executive, they have embraced and they are understanding this challenge that we're facing. And South Africa became the first country to produce the Just Transition Framework. and which was handed over to the United Nations Secretary General to show that South Africa, we are serious about this, but we have also, through the Department of Science and Innovation, produced the Hydrogen Society Roadmap as another indication about how serious we seek to intervene and exploit the opportunities provided by this climate change. It's not just a challenge, we're also identifying opportunities. So this talk this morning, therefore, is very relevant in that context. And I'm very pleased, colleagues, that Johan Schuute, who's our friend as South Africa, I don't want to read his long biography. Don't think he's that type of a person who likes to be self-praised. His work speaks for itself. If you are interested to know about him, you can Google search. I'm sure some of you have already done that before the event, but I invite you to listen attentively to him, and most importantly, engage him afterwards. Is open-minded. He helped us when we were conducting the review of the 1996 white paper on science and technology. He also helped us as community. But analysts will probably raise a question later on. But he helped us to introduce the concept of transformative change in our policy lexicon. So that concept was introduced by Johan Schuute here in South Africa, and his colleagues Chuck Daniels and others. And it found its way into our 2019 white paper, as well as the decadal plan, and through other work that they are doing, which is TIP, and globally has shaped the theoretical understanding of science, technology, and innovation. But this morning, we've asked him to look at slightly different elements of our STI policy and how it relates to sustainability. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to now invite Johan to come forward and give us a talk. So let's show him give him a warm welcome.
Thank you, Mulungizi, for your warm welcome, and all of you, and certainly also the NRF, for hosting me for this and for this event. I've been working for a long time on policy and how to ensure that science, technology, and innovation policy will deliver on, you could say, the SDGs. So deliver on poverty reduction, inequality issues, climate change, biodiversity, and not just economic growth. I know economic growth is very important, certainly in the context of South Africa, but worldwide. But I think we need a different type of economic growth, one that delivers on some of these problems. But I also had come to the conclusion that policy is not sufficient in a way, STI policy. We really need more private investment in this area, and also collaboration across private and public actors. So I started to talk to private investors about STI issues. And so I would like to talk a bit about that journey I had with him, and that led to the creation of the Deep Transition Lab, which is a sister project to the Transformative Investment Policy Consortium. And that consortium is, South Africa is a member, and the hub for Africa is located at the University of Pretoria and headed by Chuck Daniels. So South Africa is very much involved in this. So my presentation will talk about the private side. And in a way, it's the presentation I'm giving when I talk to private investors. Okay, my slides are not moving. Can someone help me? They're not moving. Okay. Well, the starting point for the conversation is the recognition that a transition is happening. So it's not something that we could say it should happen. It is happening. So, you know, we can see that climate change is happening. The biodiversity loss is already massive, but also the response. There are many, many responses across the world. And the question in a way is how to navigate this sustainability transition. And it's very clear, and this was also expressed at the COP28, is that we need a lot of investment, long-term investment, to deal with these challenges. The problem is that if you look at the private investment industry, there's a lot of focus of business as usual. So private investment is not flowing into more radical directions, and there are a range of reasons for this. And they are here on the slide. There's a short-term focus. There's a very narrow definition of fiduciary duty. And this is very important because the big capital is with institutional investors. And they have a real problem investing in Africa. Why? Because legally, they have to, that's their interpretation, they have to work towards wealth creation, and if they invest in Africa, the returns are too low and the risks are too big. So, for example, there are many solar projects, wind projects that cannot be funded by these institutional investors because of their interpretation of fiduciary duty. So the private industry, the private investment industry need to change itself. And the front runners in the private investment industry, now the ones that follow so-called ESG investment or impact investors, these are often smaller ones, they are aware of this, that their current investment practices are not delivering, and they need to move beyond that. But they say we lack the tools. So how do we know that we invest in the right type of transformation? So this is a question they have. So because of that, we put together a group of people, researchers and investors, to work together. And this is what is called transdisciplinary research. And this is also typical for the work we do with policymakers. So it's not like linear. So we researchers, we research something, and then we hand over the conclusions to the policymakers who then make decisions. Now, researchers and policymakers and other actors work together on creating the solution, but also the problem definition. So this is called transdisciplinary research. And we did this with the private investors, and this was completely new to them. Because of course they collect data, and they work with researchers, but they never let researchers inside the investment process to work with them together. And in the contract, we also stipulated that they had to spend time with us. So it's not just about saying, I'm too busy, I have no time. No, you need to spend time to really think about the problem. So let me talk a bit about this deep transition thinking, which is behind this. So what is a deep transition? Well, the first point to say is that it's a long-term change process. And we talk about the first and second deep transition. The first deep transition is the Industrial Revolution, is the current modernization process that started in the 18th century and changed the world. And this change process brought many benefits, but also a lot of problems. And the issue is that the problems are deeply ingrained in the way we have executed the first industrial revolution. So we look at this revolution as the build-up of a new set of systems. A system for energy provision, a system for mobility provision, a system for healthcare provision, food provision. And the way these systems have been built makes it impossible to deliver, for example, on climate change, because all of these systems are based on fossil fuels, for example. All of these systems are based on principles, we call them rules, that are not sustainable. So we need a complete new set of systems. Very, very small, almost non-existing. It's changing now, I know, partly because of, well, all the problems with the delivery, and there is a realization that we need to change. And of course, transitions itself will bring many challenges, and Mulungisi talked about the just transition element, which is crucially important, because transitions themselves can create injustices, and they need to be taken care of. But we need to realize that we need to, in a way, undo the first deep transition, change not one system, but many systems, and change the underlying principles and work towards a second deep transition. And this is not a small change process. So when we talk system, I just want to show this figure, and some of you may have seen this already when we're discussing policy change. So system change is not just about change of technology or science. System change also means that we need to change the market, the user preferences, that we need to change, in fact, policy, that we need to change industry structures, the business models used, and even we need to change cultural perceptions. And these are aligned. So any fundamental technological change will always lead to social change and behavioral change. So people who say we need to focus on behavioral change and not on technology, they are wrong. And the opposite is also true. You cannot push technology onto the market without also aligning it with behavioral and social and policy change. So it means that if you really want to, for example, we talked a bit about artificial intelligence beforehand, if you want to develop a policy for that, it means change of policy in a fundamental sense. It's not like you can operate on a business as usual approach. But this is still a superficial layer, because if you look at the system, so these are the system components. They are expressions of underlying rules. A rule is, for example, the linear economy, or in opposite to the circular economy, or the fossil-based economy, so the use of fossil fuels. A focus on globalization instead of localization. So there are underlying principles, you can call them the DNA of these systems, that in the end need to change. And this DNA is embedded in values and in norms. So in the end, system change is about a change of values, a change of norms, a change of these underlying rules will then become expressed in new technological options. The actors who dominate in a system, we call them regime actors. They follow these rules. They use them to decide on their preferences. So in the policy work we do, we need to challenge policy actors, but also private investors, to challenge their preferences they have. They may have preferences for investments that are really not helpful when we think about transitions. So how do transitions happen? This is also a figure I think that's known. Well, the first thing to say about it, it starts local. Because transition is a big process. At the same time, it starts small and local in what we call niches. So there are small application domains where often coalitions of actors work together to develop an alternative practice. Let's say solar, when it started in South Africa, was really small. But it can become big. And that's, of course, this process of scaling and acceleration. What we know from theory is that this breakthrough will only happen if what we call the dominant system, the regime, opens up for change. So for niches, alternative practices, new practices to be successful, some of the dominant actors in policy making, in business, need to open up and migrate towards investing in the niche. So we need this combination. And one of the reasons why these alternative practices often do not survive is because regimes stay closed. Closed for change. Oh, it's not on my screen. Yes. It's not here. Okay. And then we have something like the landscape. So the landscape is a set of trends and shocks. So these trends, like the trend towards individualization or climate change, is generated by all the systems. So they generate a trend. And this trend will then influence the dynamic between niches and regimes. So what we typically do when we work on, proposing certain change processes, we do an analysis of the niches available, whether they are strong or weak. We have indicators for that. Whether the regimes are opening up for change, and what are the shocks and mega trends that influence this dynamic. And this allows you to navigate the transition. Well, this is a picture of the first and second deep transition. I don't want to speak because there's a lot that we can say about this picture. The first thing is that the first deep transition came in waves. And these waves were connected to investment cycles. So therefore investment is so important. If you look at the vertical axis, it expresses what we call directionality. Because in these waves, at the beginning, there's often a choice. For example, if you think about the energy system now, there's a choice between a decentralized system versus a centralized system or a mixture. There's a choice for how much renewables or whether we mix it with hydrogen, for example. There are choices. So what happens over time is that choices are made, directionalities are set. And there's often a turning point or a crisis in the middle of these searches where this is happening, where actors who have been working on the various options, there's a kind of shakeout process and certain options become preferred. And historically, we have seen several waves. And the last wave has been fueled by digitalization and now also artificial intelligence. And the issue is whether we use artificial intelligence to optimize the current systems, or whether we use it to divert and build new systems. And that is the choice ahead of us. So if you think about a strategy, a digital strategy, the choice is, do we really embed it into a sustainability direction? And what are the options? Or is sustainability just an add-on? And do we focus on allowing the digital revolution to happen as it happens and optimize current systems? A very simple example is, for example, precision agriculture. So precision agriculture, we use less pesticides. That's good. It delivers impact, but it's not sufficient because we need to move to a new type of agricultural system. So investment in precision agriculture in the short term will deliver impacts, but in the long term, it will not deliver a new food system. So I talked about the project we did. So this is the Deep Transition project. This was funded by a private investor, Bailey Gifford, which is a intermediary. They invest 400 billion, so it's a big one. They invest a lot of the money of institutional investors. And they were interested because they see themselves as investors in disruption. And they say, can you develop a theory about disruption? So they funded a history project to look at historical patterns. And that's what we did. And when we developed this theory, and this is all published now, they said, okay, how can we apply this? And then we got to this stage where we brought together a number of actors. And here are the actors. And you find Daan du Toit here from South Africa. On the government side, we had Vinnova from Sweden, for example. We had Business Finland. So we had a number of government actors, but we also had a number of private investors. Institutional investors like Calster, a big pension fund in California. Ontario Teachers Pension Plan from Canada. And we had a number of impact investors. From Africa, we had Sunfunder. That's an investment firm now bought by Mirova. And they invest in the energy transition in Africa. So we brought them together and we went through a process of a whole range of sessions that we organized to develop a new way of thinking about investment. This was the research team. This led to this publication, Transformative Investment in Sustainability, and a whole set of new principles. And this you can find online and download. And these were the principles we developed. And these principles are not principles to tick the box. They are there to inspire a new practice. So if you look at them, the first principle is transform the system. So really focus your investment on system change and think long term. So don't look at short-term investment. There's other principles here, like the importance of collective action, because we have to recognize also these investors, although some of them are very big, it's not their investment which will be driving system change. We need to build what's called a capital chain. We need many investors to work together. And this is not happening. It's not just an issue of private and public partnership. It goes beyond that. Because if you look at the energy transition, for example, in Africa, or the hydrogen development in South Africa, you can see we need a whole series of investments by a series of investors, both public and private. And at the moment, this is not coordinated. So everyone is investing and itself and looking at how to do that. For example, we worked with Bailey Gifford, the firm I mentioned before, at how they invest. And they look at an individual company, and then they say, what is the positive environmental and social impact of this company? And then they invest in other companies, and they ask the question again. And they may invest, for example, in 4 food companies, but they never look at the relationships between these 4 companies. The portfolio, you could ask. But you have to go beyond. They don't look at the investment of others. So our plea with them is that we need to start to think about collective action and assess investments, not based on individual investment, but on collective action opportunities. And this is a real big change for them, but also an opportunity. There's also one here called Open Up and Don't Lock In, because you can invest, as I mentioned the example of precision agriculture, you can invest in something that can open up for further change, or you can do it in a way that locks in. And so you always have to ask this question, is this locking in? For example, the EU now has called gas technology and transition technology. They say, okay, we need to move away from fossil fuels, but the coming decades we need gas, which is true, to provision in the energy. The problem is, if you start to invest in gas infrastructure, you build sunk investments. The idea is that in 3 decades we switch. Well, that's easily said than done, of course, because of all the sunk investment. So we need to think now, how can we invest in such a way that it opens up for further change and even the abandoning of gas technology in the future. And this is a difficult challenge, but something we need to consider. There's also a principle about contextualization. And this is for me very important because of the colonial aspect. Because the first deep transition was based on a set of values that promised universal application. So what works in Europe should work in Africa, or vice versa. We know that's not the case. So it's very important that we contextualize investment and we accept that there are plural solutions, and some things may work in South Africa, they may not work in the Netherlands, the country where I come from. So the second deep transition is not about one model. It's about the fact that the model can be different in different contexts, and we need to, in fact, embrace that and see that as part of the solution. So we need to contextualize. Well, the ones on the left hand are about this new collaboration between practitioners and researchers, because we have built universities that produce papers, that produce a lot of knowledge, but the knowledge is often not used in practice. So this second deep transition also means the transformation of the research system and the transformation of the way universities operate, and they need to collaborate much more closely with practitioners. This does not mean for me that we get applied research, because a lot of my colleagues say you do applied research. They mean it's less important. Well, I say no, I ask very fundamental questions about societal change together with practitioners. And their views are as important as the academic views. It's a different view. They have their own knowledge, but it's important to work together. So we should train young people in the research process nowadays in this type of transdisciplinary research, because this is the research for the future. And certainly if we want to address the problems we have, and if we want to use the resources, because I heard about budget cuts for the R&D, which is dramatic, because I do think we need a strong knowledge system, but at the same time, if this knowledge system is not put to use, to good use, you can invest a lot, it doesn't help. So it's also about how we use the investment, and we should use this investment for transformative purposes. And that's part of the message here. We should also try to build more synergies between the public and the private side. So with these principles, then together with these investors, we looked at, so what are the rules currently that drives your investment? And these were the kind of top line rules. They need to maximize financial return. They are asked to do that. And so the return they speak about is 8% to 20%. Well, this is in what they call emerging markets ridiculous, certainly in the short term. So this call for maximizing financial return without taking into consideration all the social and ecological negative impacts is part of the problem. And then this fiduciary duty I already talked about, which is also, it's a legal problem. I think we will see court cases. We did a study for the, there's a network of, it's called the network of supervisors and central banks for the greening of the finance industry. And because of the climate agreement, the Paris Agreement, they ask now investors, institutional investors, to align their portfolio with the Paris Agreement. And the question is how to do that. And well, they've provided scenarios. And then these financial investors need to look at these scenarios and look at their portfolios and look at the alignment question. We looked at these scenarios. We were asked to unpack them and from a transition angle. And this report is published. You can find it. We looked at several regions because we looked at the Pampas region in Argentina. We looked at Sahel in Africa. And we looked at the Chinese region because we wanted to be specific. And we could show, first of all, that many of the scenarios that were provided did not take into account conflict, violence, war. It ignored migration. So there were many what we call shocks, landscape shocks, that were completely ignored. So we rebuilt these scenarios with having these shocks in mind. And then we could show that their portfolios are really at risk. So they may think they can maximize value in the future, but they are wrong, because they do not take into account of these shocks. And our argument in the report is that these shocks are not probable or a surprise. They are certain. They are coming. So the fiduciary duty is no longer just to ignore these shocks and focus on wealth creation, as if you can ignore them. The fiduciary duty is to take them into account. And I predict there will be legal cases the coming decade in the US to expand the fiduciary duty and to take these shocks into account. Because they will really influence the wealth creation aspect. There's also a strong focus on quantifiable risk in this sector, which of course leads to, they ignore many other aspects that cannot be quantified, and there's this focused on short term. So the current investment regime, because the financial system is also a system, you know, the rules in the system, they do not allow, in fact, to invest in the transition. So we need a change of rules. And therefore we formulated a new set of rules that at the moment are not applied. But what we are doing now is we work with a set of private investors in this deep transition lab to apply them. So we are building a niche, we apply our own theory, we are building a niche in the finance industry using these rules. And look for a new type of investments that follow these rules. We still argue that the returns are important, because we had a whole debate, because some of the impact investors say, forget about return. We don't need return. That's part of the problem. This is kind of debatable. We should, and at the moment, for example, I'm working with a big foundation. They have a big endowment, and they are investing the endowment in a quite traditional way, and they have returns. And they use the returns for social projects, housing for the poor, for example. But now they are questioned whether they can just focus their big endowment, whether they can focus the investment in this traditional way. So some people argue they should forget about any financial return for this endowment, just and invest now all the money. So give up, in a way, the endowment. This is one path. And I can tell you some of these investors are considering, and this one, it's the Roundtree Foundation in the UK, and they have an endowment of 650 million. They are considering that, also because the money was generated based on slavery. So perhaps it's justified to give it away. The other option is to invest it much better. Invest it in transition, but then you should accept lower returns, first of all, and you should invest in system change. We also should abide by this expanded definition of fiduciary duty, where we take into account future shocks. We should not just look at quantification when we look at risk, but we should include rebound effects, broader repercussion. And here, for example, the just transition element comes in and is very important, because if you invest in a transition, for example, you move away from coal, of course, there's a big problem with jobs. So how do you make sure that you generate more jobs than you destroy? And these investors, these private investors, also should take that into account. So when we now work with these investment committees, with these firms, we ask these questions. We say, okay, you invest in this company or this set of companies. What are the broader repercussions and the rebound effects of these investments? And at the moment, they have no answers. So they start for the first time to collect data and ideas about that. And then we want them to focus on the long term. Well, okay, sorry. So, okay, I miss a slide, but okay. So what we have done, we have put together a lab. We call it a lab, but it's not a legal entity. It's a network of actors. The actors do sign a contract. It's similar to TIPSI, the Transformative Innovation Policy Consortium, and the hub led by Chucks here in Africa. And we do three things. We do experiments. We do investment experiments. So what is an investment experiment? It's a learning process. So we sit with the investment committee of an impact investor, for example, and we say, okay, you invest in, let me take the example, these 4 or 5 food companies. How do we know whether these investments lead to system change? So what we do with them, we say, okay, what is the kind of future you want to invest in? So we call them desirable futures. So we design not one, but several futures, possible futures in system terms. So how should the food system look like in 2050? And then you can specify also the region or the area. And so we look at the system elements, the policies, the user preferences, the rules, the actors. So we specify, and not one future, several futures, and it needs to be a desirable future. And then we ask the question, how can we get there? So we design together with them transition pathways. And then we locate the investments inside these pathways. So first of all, what we show is that investment is of course not leading to transition. It's contributing. But we can also show that many investments are missing, in fact. And we can show that we need what we call policies or complementary action to make these investments profitable. So they should work with policymakers more. But we also look at the rebound and broader repercussions on the people, on the ground, on communities. And we ask, do you talk to the communities? Because you make food investments in food companies in Africa, for example, but have you ever listened to the communities? And these investors, they don't. They collect data, but they never do that. So these experiments are learning processes in which these investors start to reorient and the way they think about their investment, and hopefully that will lead to a change of the investment practice. Of course, that's their choice. We as researchers participate. For us, this is research. So we will publish about this. But that's another principle of the lab. Everything is open access. I don't sign non-disclosure agreement, also not with private investors. So what we will learn, we will make available to everyone. Some of the investors don't want to join the lab for this reason, but then we don't work with them. Then we do research and analysis, and this research needs to support, of course, the experiments, and we have a whole program for training and capability building together with TIPSI. So we hope to develop this together with the policymaker and bring the private investors and the public investors together in the room. So this is the program of work. Well, these are the 4 types of experiments we have. So we can in the experiment look at investment, but let's say 3 or 4 companies. But we also, in some of the experiments, look at monitoring. So how do we know whether transformative impact is realized? What are the indicators? Then we look at portfolios. So portfolios are an entire fund. For example, with Baillie Gifford, they have the Positive Change Fund. They invest in 50 companies. So we look at the entire portfolio of all the companies and all the synergistic effects across. And then we look at transition bundles. And this is an interesting one because this is about public and private. We have now agreed with the government of Catalonia, that's a region in Spain, to build a transition bundle. So we will involve the private investors and public investors in a transition towards a circular economy. So it's a long-term project that we have agreed to develop. Well, the DT Lab will collaborate with TIPSI, so I see them as sister projects. And South Africa, as I said, has been part since the beginning of of TIPSI, and is the host of the University of Pretoria of the hub. And TIPSI also does policy experimentation, research, capacity building, so has a similar structure. So therefore, I also hope that South Africa will contribute and start working with the Deep Transition Lab. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johan. Let's take questions, comments, and then introduce yourself if you don't mind. Benny, are you able to give calls the roving mics? Oh, you do have. Okay, just plug in. Okay, thanks, guys.
National Innovation Agency. I was just wondering about the paradigm of investing paradigm that investing in system change doesn't necessarily come with high returns. Does that hold always? Because there are investments in paradigm which are doing consideration.
Thanks. And innovations in transformative technologies and systems which do relate to high returns. So is that something that you've had to challenge with investors? Or
so do relate to, sorry?
To high returns.
Oh, to high returns, yes. The question is, of course, if there is high returns, where does the money flow to? Following from the high returns. So we are, for example, if we now want to build collective action. So for example, philanthropy, they may become part of an investment strategy where they give the money for free. Then some of the institutional investors come in and they will earn in the long term a lot of money because of the philanthropy. So we asked a question about the revolving fund principle. So some of these high returns may have to come back in the fund. So this is about the construction of the fund. And so our principal decision was not to challenge returns, because returns are necessary, because if they are investments. The question is, how do we use these returns, acknowledging that the pressure for high returns at the moment are part of the problem, because it means that certain type of investments are not possible because of this request for high returns. So we need to moderate, at least in the niche we try to build with these actors, we challenge this request.
Thanks.
Oh, okay, it's Joel Slawaka from Sila Union Academic Search Engine. By the way, your research appears to be more of an external kind of research, not not necessarily localized in a way, because I thought maybe bring practical local solutions that we could actually be able to, especially looking at the financial sector. I think that our financial sector here, our financial system is not coming into the party in trying to resolve some of the challenges that we are confronted with.
Yeah, so the local aspect. Of course, the lab, I'm not talking about Tipsy because that's also different, but the lab, they invest in a set of companies, and then we do look at the locality, because these companies operate, they produce products, they operate in a certain local context. So we try to look at the local context, because the starting point is what they invest in. And then we try to bring back to these investors characteristics of the local context, and we also try to convince them that they need to talk with local for example, if they invest in solar in East Africa, and at the moment we are talking with Mirova, they are setting up a big investment fund called Kikaton. The question is, if they invest in the energy transition in Africa, do they talk with the local communities, and how? Are these local communities involved in the investment process? At the moment, this is not happening. So we do try to make the connection, but you're right, many of these actors operate globally. Our point is you need to connect locally, because your investments have local impact. Is that an answer to your question, or?
Not necessarily. I think maybe let me rephrase it. Recently, I submitted a paper to the Reserve Bank because they were also looking for researchers to answer some of the challenges with which we could actually try to resolve some of our own problems. And obviously, some of the solutions that I was providing to the Reserve Bank was the fact that, the people who drafted the financial system are actually the Americans. And the Reserve Bank needs to learn from them how they can actually solve some of the challenges that we are confronted with from the Americans. Because, for example, one of the solutions that I was proposing to the Reserve Bank was that indeed the Reserve Bank needs to be decentralized. Because even the Americans, when they first built the Federal Reserve System, they rejected the idea of a central banking system. That is why I was just saying to you, your research seems to, if somebody was listening to you, it really feels foreign, not South African in a way. And how do you maybe communicate with the local financial system in the country to actually to invest in technologies that the country would need from 10 years from now?
Okay, well, the answer to that is you're right. Although some of the actors we work with, like Sunfunder, are local. Sunfunder is a company in Kenya, so they are a local financial actor. But we want to build bridges. So the work of the lab is to try to build bridges between local financial actors and the global ones. So we are starting to do this in Catalonia, the example I mentioned. But the lab started last autumn. So we are just starting up. So I'm here now in South Africa, also to see how we can build those bridges. But your observation in that sense is right, yes.
Try to say at the beginning that the intention of having this conversation here is to explore what is being done elsewhere and how we can use, if necessary, that which is being experimented elsewhere for our own, to fit our own purpose. So that's partly so it's sharing the experiences of what is being done elsewhere and exploring the possibility that if we were to use the concept here, how we can, and that becomes our responsibility as South Africans, if we share the same sentiment. So the other hand here, start with you, if you want to take.
Yeah, but then I may have to write down.
Yeah.
Let me get a piece of paper. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah. So we'll take several questions, then Johan will respond. So let's start with you.
Great.
Yeah, let's give her. She's already having a mic.
Thanks, Professor. My name is Georgina Ryan. I'm an economist, or a director of environmental economics in the National Treasury. So I sit in the microeconomics division, but I work with macroeconomists. I'm very interested to hear how you engage with economists on this and what the analytical tools are to understand this perspective. I don't think it's limited to the financial sector. I don't think it's a financial systems question. I do think it intersects very well with industrial policy. But I see this as micro experiments that don't really speak to macroeconomics. So you did speak at the beginning about, reimagining growth and speaking to a better type of growth, but you're going to embed these outcomes in terms of economics that we need to understand. So I think the language of economics and how you translate the outcomes not only speaks to return on investments, but the economic outcomes. So I wanted to ask what your analytical tools are for unpacking the economic experiment that you're also doing, and especially as it relates to industrial policy, because you'll come out with policies that are very interesting. And I think the Americans with their Inflation Reduction Act are possibly putting up a very big experiment that we need to explore. So I'd like an answer around the analytical tools for the economists. What are the economists saying in this space?
Great.
My name is Iran Belodia. I'm the Pro Vice Chancellor for Climate and Inequality at Wits University. I have two questions. The first is I'm kind of a little surprised that there's not that kind of among your 12 principles for investment, that there's not a stronger focus around kind of changing patterns of inequality across the world. So when you unpack it, really, I think climate change is a question of parts of the world kind of consuming too much and parts of the world not kind of having enough to consume. And it doesn't seem to me that you're driving that change in your principles. The second point's the kind of economists' kind of question. I think we're now seeing some kind of evidence of unintended consequences of things like ESG. So the reality is that investment happens with large funds across the world, and there's now some sense that what the big kind of investors like BlackRock do is that the more these factors are placed on their kind of investment agenda, the more likely they are to exclude regions of the world, such as Africa, from any investments at all. And so any thoughts on these, the kind of potential for tools like this to divert investment, and how can we change that sort of behavior? So I don't disagree with your central point. I just think that change kind of has to be driven in more innovative ways.
Great. Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Hermina Mako. I'm from the University of Pretoria, Department of Political Science, and the African Center for the Study of the United States. In your presentation, you talked about risk factors that low or result in lower returns when investing into wealth creation in Africa. And I just wanted to ask, in particular, investing in Africa in wealth creation, isn't it a good thing, especially considering that Africa has some of the fastest growing economies in the world and a young and vibrant market? Wouldn't the multinational corporations that invest in wealth creation, wouldn't they be able to make even more of their returns? Thank you.
Sepa?
Thank you very much. From having worked with TIP, experimentation, we have since learned quite a lot on the transformative innovation policy frameworks, processes, and tools, especially for the built environment and also for the sanitation sector in South Africa, where we were looking at alternative technologies and how we can open up regimes and niches and support the regime change within these sectors, sanitation and human settlements. But here is a question. So it seems from the transformative investment for system change, as you have presented, you're looking at private investors mainly, or even public investors. But we know in the South African context, the procurement budget is about 29 billion rands, which very much exceeds the government expenditure on R&D. So how does the theory brings that into the discussion? How has the theory or the presentation or the principles has it taken that into account? So that's one question, because public procurement is big and it could be used as a transformative tool in itself. Then the other one, with the lab at University of Pretoria, what sort of use cases can you share with us that are coming out of that particular lab? Thank you very much.
Okay. I think the important thing for me is that when investors look at investment, they look inward, they start with the investment and they look outward. Okay, how will this investment generate impact? Also with ESG. So what we do the opposite. We first go outward, we look, okay, what is the world you want to create? It's not the plausible world, it's the desirable world. So including, that's speaking to the inequality aspect, this also speaks to some of the macroeconomic aspects. So what is the desirable world? And we try to describe this in system terms, because for us, many of the unemployment trends, for example, are landscape trends. The issue is, how are they produced? And in our theory, they are produced through the way we build systems. So if we build systems, for example, that drive based on driving labor productivity, so pushing people out of the jobs, okay, you get certain trends. So we look at the rules that drive systems, and they will generate certain structural employment features. And that's where, so how we build the connection. So we look from systems to economic characteristics across systems, because, for example, the employment structure is shaped by the way these systems are built. And the systems are built originally through niches. That's the micro, local level. So it's important to realize that our full attention, in a way, is focused on these niches. Because these investors, they invest in companies, but we say, no, you invest in niches. And niches is a much broader concept. It's an environment. A niche is a whole set of actors, including policy actors, including procurement. So it involves all the actors who are trying to build that local environment. And the companies are just one of them. So we want them to consider the entire coalition and network of actors involved. And how can they make this niche thrive? Investment is just one of the factors. And that's already because they have a very linear view, investment leading to impact. And that's part of the problem, because it's much more complex. So what we try to look at is contribution, which is difficult enough. How does your investment contribute to broader change processes? And we try to specify this in terms of outcomes and a theory of change. So what we built is a theory of change around their investments that look at the outcomes that they then can measure in their monitoring. I try to address the various questions. So the degrowth discussion is not central in our narrative. Central in our narrative is the issue that we need new systems. So we need investments flowing to systems with new characteristics. And one of the characteristics needs to be that it does not enhance inequality. But it's not just about inequality, because we really try to say, just focusing on inequality without thinking about climate change. So we look at the trade-offs. Because on a systemic level, they are connected. But the whole approach, again, is focused on this. Try to build alternative practices that really are the seeds for new systems that will change the structure of the economy, acknowledging that this is a very long-term process. So it's impossible, of course, to change the economy overnight. What is possible is to contribute to the seeds and build seeds that will be very influential, because in our model, again, we also assume that certain shocks will happen. The oil crisis was a shock in the West. We studied in our research the oil crisis, but it didn't lead to a lot of change in the energy system. Why not? There were no niches, there were no alternatives, there was no solar, there was no wind. So the system could not respond. So investment in niches is also investment in preparedness, because times will become rough. That's, given the state of the world, hard to avoid. The question is, how prepared is South Africa to act? And you can work on this. So develop your anticipation quality. I don't know how to call it, preparedness. And of course, you can try to model then employment effects, macroeconomic effects. So you talked about the tools. I would welcome any work on this. This is not the work we do. We are not economists, but it would be great if economists start to do that.
Charity and Ade, okay. Petros thereafter. Any other hands? Colleagues, you still have some time. Again, it's not just posing questions. You can also comment, engage, all right? Charity, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Johan. I've got a comment and a question. Oh, sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Charity Mbileni Morema from NACI, National Advisory Council on Innovation. The first comment that I've got a comment and a question. The comment is that let me appreciate you for a very good presentation, eye-opening and very incisive, especially for me because I'm not in this particular space. I'm more into, innovation, science, and technology. So I'm quite appreciative of the fact that you have opened up, my eyes in terms of transformative change insofar as investments are concerned. That's number one. And then the fact that I was going to ask a question in terms of the challenges that you had identified insofar as investors are looking at Africa. One, you spoke about the focus. Secondly, you spoke about fiduciary duties and all of that. But I need to acknowledge the fact that when you then gave us, your strategies in how you are suggesting that, those challenges should be addressed, I was quite happy with that. So now the question that I have is that, when you spoke about system shocks, and quite interestingly, as I was listening to you, the focus was more on Africa insofar as, your force majeure, your issues in terms of wars are concerned. However, you did not indicate how the system shocks could have an opportunity cost. System shocks in Europe could have an opportunity cost for emerging economies. I'm saying this, considering the fact that the Ukraine and Russia war had a very negative effect on many countries in Europe. For instance, Germany had to go back and recommission their coal-fired plants because there was no gas anymore. Have you looked at the fact that that particular aspect could have had a negative effect on emerging economies, meaning that there is a system shock insofar as Europe is concerned? You did not anticipate it in terms of how you modeled you prepared your model, number one. But number two is that the opportunity cost insofar as investors are concerned, that investment could have gone elsewhere to emerging economies, but it had to be then redirected to Germany to solve the problems that you did not anticipate insofar as system shocks are concerned. Thank you.
Petros?
Thank you very much, Johan. I do admire transformative innovation, but maybe let me come to a controversial comment. The Boston Consulting Metrics, they will talk about things like the stars, the dogs, and so on. The challenge with transformative innovation, the investors tend to be too pressing, especially when it comes to developing countries. I'll make the example of Sasol. Sasol needs a cash cow in Sasolburg, it needs a cash cow in Secunda. So the existing operations in order to fund their transformation. But the investors normally are too harsh to say, if you don't transform now, we are cutting our investment. I think the same applies to Eskom. I think the investors are coming very hard on them. So is there anything called irresponsible transformative investment? I think there are allegations to say the West tend to use the developing countries like South Africa to experiment the transformative. So they'll bring money as an experiment to say, let's study the shock. Let's see how the shock happens in developing countries. Then they take those lessons, they go back to their countries, then they successfully complete a transformative change in their countries. What is your comment there? Thank you.
Any other comments, colleagues? Yes? And I'm sure NACI has a comment. A group executive from NACI. So This guy can kill all of us in a split second, so he must give us some sense of comfort. You can't be dealing with nuclear and keep quiet here.
Thank you.
You are next.
My name is Valerie Naidu. I'm from the Water Research Commission. We've worked previously on the TIPSI program, and I'm interested that, firstly, how does one get involved in the DT labs? Secondly, quite clearly, there's still quite a bit of thinking to be done with investors and economists. I think the DT labs will help, but are you planning short courses for investors, economists, and the RDI community in terms of how you collaborate in those spaces? And based on your current experiments within the DT lab, are you also planning sort of investment policy guidance, not only for public sector, but also for the private sector, and bringing into, which I think you correctly mentioned, the niches and the microeconomy just as important as the macroeconomy, because sometimes we pay too much attention to the macroeconomy. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I realize I did not answer an earlier question about wealth creation in Africa and whether investors have problems seeing that given all the potential in Africa. The problem is their framework. You know, the kind of rules I explained prevent them to act on it. So let me be very clear. The way the financial sector works is a part of the problem. I'm not giving here a very positive story about the financial sector. The only thing they need to go through a change. Yes. And the DT lab is an attempt to work with some investors to experiment with how to do that. And of course, it's a minor in the larger scheme of things. It's very minor. The only thing that gives hope is that any change in the world has start local, minor. We have to realize that. So it's a question, how can we build it? And we build it through making connections. Other people, and for example, the TIPSI work has seen that. We had one experiment on water management in South Africa, but some of the learnings has been taken up by other actors. Petrus here being one of the examples. So we have built in TIPSI is what we call a resource lab with 30 or 300 tools and cases. It's open access. And now we have a lot of actors, so it's crowdsourcing their experiences. They are using it and giving back what they've learned. Because this change will not happen because of TIPSI or because of the DT lab. It will happen because of a social movement emerging where many people are contributing. So we need to we need to change the finance industry. And that's a big challenge. And we need to, make them move away from this focus on immediate results. Because one of our messages is, well, I didn't show the picture here, is that impact cannot be measured with short-term quantitative tools, like how many people did you lift out of poverty? They need to show, well, 10,000 people we lift out of poverty in 2 years. And then they have impact. It's often very shallow. If you go beyond these figures, it's not about structural change. So if you measure impact, you need long-term Shocks, yes, we do look at Europe. The report we did on shocks, I can give you the reference. First of all, shocks can have different type. They can also have negative impact. They can have positive. They can lead to opportunities, new opportunities, but they also lead to something we call imprinting, because certain things become not imaginable anymore because of the shock. So they imprint new rules in people, which is different. Opportunity is something like rational. You can take it or not take it. But imprinting, if you look at wars, they change people. They create trauma. So we look at some of the emotional traumatic effects of war, also European wars, and how that changed the way decision makers see the decision space. It's different. For example, the issue of local production became much more prominent after the Ukraine war because of the disruption of the supply chains. People start to open up for complete new options that were not options before. Reopening coal in Germany was an example, although this is a very temporary response. This is I think in Germany there's a clear vision about where they want to go to. The issue is a bit about nuclear, the future of nuclear in this whole process. Let me say about how do you get involved in the lab. Well, the lab is private investors. So private investors working together with a research team. But this lab wants to work locally. So if we have, for example, could build transition bundles in South Africa with private investors and public investors together. So it's about setting up experiments. That's one way to get involved. And I hope the hub led by Chucks here at University of Pretoria will play a very positive role in setting up these experiments. And on Friday, we have a discussion with the government of Malawi, South Africa, Botswana, and Kenya to discuss options, in fact. So this Friday here at the University of Johannesburg, we will do capacity building courses, learning environment, building a learning environment, set of tools, make them available. We have to realize that the difficulty of this type of work is the amount of work to do is massive. The amount of funding is small. Because if government gives funding, let me also say that there are also always many conditions put on top of that. And for example, certain type of money I don't use because I have to hire an administrator to deal with all the requirements. So I spent 40% of my budget. Principally, I now try to work with donations. Why? Because there's nothing attached to it. In terms of, what we do is building collective resource, collective tissue, it's a public good, what we try to build with the TIPSI and DT lab. And that's, strangely enough, very difficult to fund. But I'm not complaining. I'm just noting a fact because I see it's difficult, and I see, of course, all the budget constraints and why there's a lot of pressure on the government side, for justification and accountability and transparency. But some of this is also part of the problem because this accountability drives for short term. And we need to really think about the long term here. That's the difficulty. So I would like to thank you again for all your questions, really good questions. And I hope this is the beginning, but also the continuation of a fruitful collaboration.
Thanks, Jan. It's actually interesting. I was listening to you and trying to figure out how to localize some of these things.
The truth of the matter is that as a country that's still developing in certain aspects, the basic needs of people is what you first put on the table. And the other aspect is how do we also ensure South Africa is not looked upon as the net consumer of this technology or ideology that's being developed. Obviously, from a nuclear energy cooperation perspective, that's something we also are grappling with in terms of an investment. We all know that the energy challenges we face as a country, and how do we move forward, in terms of the massive investment needed. And one of the things that we have been unpacking is what is our assets as a country? What do we actually do or can do to be a net contributor? And we've unpacked a few ideas, especially around the nuclear fuel technology, which we have developed and actually excelled in over the years. But we just haven't pursued it in the last couple of years. And now we are actually being approached by big, powerful international players coming and saying, let's work together. And we're making sure that in all our discussions, we are an equal contributor, not just being pushed aside and said, you just supply this and we pay you for it and walk away. No. And that's one of the things that I think as a country we have to focus on. We have to focus on in terms of these experiments, as you say, but the reality is that we need to stand as Africa on an equal footing with the rest of the world. They will not be able to proceed in terms of certain technology without us as Africa having a say. And we need to hold that space very tightly. We're finding that happening. We're finding, for example, you look at the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. That's the next direction that, we have already started, but we are moving more and more into that as the corporation that I'm working with. And even in that space, how do we stand our ground? In the area of medical isotopes, we are about the third or fourth biggest supplier in the world right now. And we built this corporation out of our research labs. And this is where I think we need to say, how do we, as Africa, stand up and be an equal player, and not look upon this as a model being developed somewhere in Europe, and we try to be the recipients of it. But thank you.
Yeah, Ilse and Lindile. And then let me check the other hands if there are still further comments. I'm sure Ilse will have a lot to say. She's sitting next to you. And Lindile, you're next.
Thank you very much. I'm Ilse Kar. I'm from the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, working in the Industry 4.0 space. And I'm also a council member of NACI. Thank you very much for the presentation. I think it's very insightful and refreshing to see that there are a lot of work that's being done, bringing public and private sector together. I think in South Africa, that's a space where we can improve on, is to bring academia closer to the industry. And in that space, there's a lot of opportunities, especially in the context of the 4IR, where we can do projects that have a lot of impact. Being also ex-Treasury official, I know that there are a lot of pockets of money lying around. And the issue for me was always, how do you develop policy where you bring then policy to social impact and economic impact? How do you build those bridges? And I think that's where we have to focus our work. So I look forward to having engagements with you, especially from the council side, to look at innovations and how do we take innovations to the commercialization space with sustainability in mind. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I'm Lindy Ladons from NACI. Based on the presentation that you have shared with us, I'd be interested to hear from you what are some of the key lessons, especially in the developing country context, in terms of the barriers when it comes to the adoption of these investment rules. In this regard, I would refer to some of the institutional barriers in terms of the awareness and market dynamics, the dominant players in the market, as well as the regulatory barriers. Thank you.
Well, to start with the last question, the barriers are massive because there's a lot of resistance, in fact, among many of the players to do radical new things. So therefore, in our method, we have this focus on experimentation. So learning processes. So we try to say to the actors, we don't want to write papers. We don't want to write new policy documents because we can spend a lot of time and put things on papers. We want to focus on implementation, first of all. So we want to talk about actual investments, not about frameworks or whatever. And we want to experiment with actual real-time investment and see how we can make a change. The difficulty is it's small, but our theory of change is that if you can scale the small and have the right type of policy to connect it to other things, you can have a bigger impact, but in the long term. So we also have to be modest in that sense and really acknowledge the problems. And one of the problems is indeed that a lot of the actors in the global north want to use the global south, this has been mentioned before, as a place to experiment. And they have no interest in really changing investment practice. And a good example is green hydrogen, because we can develop green hydrogen also in South Africa as the future extractivist mode. You produce the green hydrogen, you export it to us, and we use it, for our industries to build them. So the question is, how can you, use it locally? And help it to serve basic needs of people in your country. This should be a question which is up front, and I really like the idea that you should stand your ground, and you can, I think, because the problems will not move away. The pressure on solving them will become bigger and bigger, and the opportunity space for coming up with solutions are in the global south. Partly because you have sometimes the lock-in in existing systems is smaller. But of course, if we fall back on the old relationship where and this happened in the colonial relationship, because many of the new technologies in the first deep transitions were experimented with in the colonies, and then the results were brought back to the global north and they profited from it. It even goes back to the story of the Industrial Revolution, which supposedly started in the UK and then was diffused through the world, which is not true. It started in many parts in the world. The UK was the aggregator and profited and benefited from it. So, and for me, the second deep transition, what is really about is a more plural model, and the fact that some of the countries can have different paths and should be able to define their own future much more. So standing your ground, I think, is an excellent principle that I really would like to endorse, acknowledging at the same time that we are part of a global world. You need global capital to work for you. And the question is, indeed, how to do that. And that's what we need to think about more. One last comment is that the focus really needs to be on system change, because we should not forget that a lot of investment is really not changing in a deep sense the current systems. And that is a problem because we add sustainability to something which is not sustainable in the long term. So part of our work is to really try to get these investors stay focused on system change, which is difficult enough, also for policy actors, by the way, because people want to go for the easy wins, which is understandable. But in the current climate, in a broad sense, this is not the best solution. We need to go for the hard wins. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's give Johan a round warm of applause. Let me invite the chairperson to thank all of us. And maybe before, the people who are joining us virtually, we didn't check if you have any comments. But Chair, maybe you can come. They would let us know.
Thank you, CE. First, let me start with the most important announcement for the morning. We do have coffee, so we did manage to organize coffee. Please feel free after you leave here to join us for a cup of coffee outside. My second part is to thank everybody for today. First, let me thank our host, NRF, and a member of the council. Thank you very much for hosting this successful event. Secondly, I'd like to thank Chuck Daniels from the University of Pretoria for part of this coordination. Let me also thank Dr. Cele, the CEO of NACI, for putting together this event, and the Secretariat in total. Also, thanks my council members who are here today for this event, and all the people who have made time to attend this event here, both physically and online. Thank you very much for your time. We appreciate it. Before I let you guys go, so let me maybe summarize today's discussion and maybe give some context where we're going with this thing. And I'm going to finish thanking Prof lastly. By the way, I did thank you, Chucks. I think Professor raised a number of issues, but there's one thing that I think I want you to take away from this conversation. Concepts and ideas, they're good, but they only become impactful once they become practical. If you take something and you put it in a practical space, that's where the real value of knowledge comes from. And I think a number of you have raised a number of questions. The issue of localization is key. How do we take these learnings and this experience and bring it to home? Because what NACI is all about, when we try to give advice, I always say, we don't give advice that sounds too good on paper, and people say, but can this really work? I think the leader from the Treasury makes a good point. The economics of these things, because the biggest problem in South Africa is financial sector, and I think Prof was correct. It's the biggest problem in this country. Until such time that we get a financial sector that understand that their role is not about just about high return investment. And I think that's the heart of your conversation. And I think that's for NACI a big conversation we must take forward. How do we take these concepts and apply them in real life and have real conversation to change? This country, if you listen to the president, we have a number of very, very big transformative initiatives that are coming up. Whether we're talking hydrogen, electric vehicles, these are huge investments this country is going to put. We cannot make the same mistake, but we don't think in a transformative investment approach. And that's a conversation we must have. How do you take those 12 principles and apply it in a real context and see if this could be implemented? Because, and I always say to people, if we don't do that, then we're just having conversation for the sake of conversation. For my council members, I think your work is cut out. NACI Prof, we have two initiatives that we really want to influence very aggressively. There's a hydrogen economy and innovation fund. And I like CE, you to coordinate the follow-up meeting with the Prof, so that we start having deep conversation, maybe the second round of the conversation, should how do we take this concept
and put into practical things that are happening in our country. Because when we do that, I think we can definitely make a change. So those are my summary comments and things that I've said. In conclusion, I'd like to thank Professor Johan Schultz for a very fantastic work. And like I said, Dr. Cele will engage you and we'll have more conversation. Hopefully next time when we do have a follow-up, we'll have specific localized conversations and localized example, because I think a lot of people want to hear how we can implement that. On that note, colleagues, thank you much for your time. I appreciate it. Thanks. Bye.